Please join me in welcoming the Honorable Mike Lee.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you. I always enjoy walking into a place where I see a lot of Adam Smith ties. It just makes me happy. I'm always amused when, in an introduction, somebody refers to me as, as a senator or as the honorable. It reminds me of what my dad used to tell me. He said, it's kind of funny how we refer to people. If there's a guy you know who's really fat, sometimes you call him slim. If there's a guy you know who's completely bald, sometimes you'll call him curly. And if you know a politician, well, you call him honorable. That tells us something. As was mentioned a minute ago, I am part of a new crop in Congress. I've been in the Senate now for 2.5 years. When I was elected in 2010, and when I took office, I was 39 years old. And as I pointed out to my colleagues, I was reading at the level of a 40-year-old, and they found that very impressive. I'm now 42, and I like to say that I read at the level of a 43-year-old, always staying just a little ahead of the curve. But they didn't know quite what to do with me when I got there for a variety of reasons. Among them, the fact that I didn't look like a senator to a lot of them, especially to the security guards. This was perplexing to them. When I approached the Senate chamber, or sometimes even the Capitol, the heavily armed, burly guards outside the door would sometimes look at me and point to another door as if to say the door for the interns is over there. And, I'm a teetotaling kid from Utah who's never had a drink, so let's just say I'm not used to getting carded. But I had to get used to getting carded when I got to the Senate. For the first few months, I got carded a lot, and this is the card I had to produce. It says United States Senator representing Utah. I have my name on it. It says expiration January 3rd, 2017. That could be when I personally expire or my term of office. Nobody's told me for sure yet. But the security guards would look at it. They would examine the tamper-resistant strip to make sure it was legitimate. Making sure, of course, I didn't buy it in Georgetown from Bob's fake ID outlet. After 30 or 40 awkward seconds, they would look at each other and shrug their shoulders and say, okay, I guess you can go on in. And then after a while, I discovered a shortcut to this ritual. This lapel pin was given to me when I was sworn in. Initially, I just put it in my desk drawer in the office and closed it because I thought I don't really need that. And then somebody told me, no, they make this specifically so that the Capitol Hill Police will recognize you. And I've worn it whenever we're in session, when I'm on Capitol Hill ever since then. It works like a charm. I call it my sorry senator pin because when they card me, I point to it and the police say, sorry, Senator, you can come on in. And it works really well most of the time. Every once in a while, it doesn't. After I had been there for a while, and most of the security were recognizing me. I was on the Senate floor, had made it through that checkpoint. I was standing at my desk in between a couple of votes. All of our votes are cast by roll call, so the process will take sometimes 15 or 20 minutes. We're stuck in the late 18th century in that respect. But I had one arm gently resting on my desk, and I was thinking about how the next vote was going to turn out. And one of the non-uniformed security personnel came up to me inside the Senate chamber and said, excuse me, will you please not lean on the senator's desk? I found it odd that he said the senator's desk and not this desk or your desk, but never mind, I respond well to authority. I said, I'm terribly sorry, it won't happen again. I thought he was just being protective of the desk. You see, these desks, some of them are about 200 years old, almost as old as some of my colleagues. And so I said, terribly sorry, it won't happen again. And he says, are you with the minority? And I said, well, what do you mean, on this vote or the next? I don't always vote with my party. Sometimes they get it wrong. No, do you work for the minority leader? And I said, well, I support the minority leader. He's our leader. In a sense, I guess I could say I work for the 3 million people of my state. And he says, no, are you part of the minority leader's staff? And only then did I really get what the problem was. And so I pointed to the sorry senator pin, thinking that would resolve it. Blank stare. He didn't get it. So I was still not used to using my title. I don't like to use my title, and so I kind of mumbled my next statement. I said, "No, I'm Senator Lee," and he said, "What?" And I said, "Okay. My name is Mike Lee. I represent a state called Utah. It's sort of squarish. It resembles a chair. It's in the Rocky Mountains." Then and only then did he get it. All the color drained from his face, and he said in one hurried breath, "I'm terribly sorry. My name is Steve, if you want to report me." And then he ran for the door. I felt bad for Steve, and I didn't want him to beat himself up over it, so I chased after him, but he was too fast. But to this day, whenever I pass Steve in the hall, I say, "Hi, Steve," and I wave and I smile. Sometimes I shake his hand just so he knows that we're friends. There are no hard feelings. It's really not a big deal. Only recently did it occur to me, his name's probably not Steve. It's probably Bob, and Steve's the guy he works with that he hates, but that's Washington. This story has reminded me that there are certain things that we have to assert that are ours, that belong to us, that if not properly asserted, even when asserting them is difficult, even when it's something that may cause us some discomfort, we nonetheless have to assert them, or they will cease to be ours. They will cease to be meaningful. They will cease to serve the function that they're there to serve. Now, had I not asserted my right to be in the Senate that day, I might have found myself getting hauled off in handcuffs, much to the amusement of some of my colleagues who might have waited a few minutes before telling them, "Oh yeah, he's okay to be here." I might have not been able to vote that day, but because I asserted my right to be there, even though it was difficult, I got to stay, I got to continue casting my votes. This is not an experience in this respect that is unique to United States senators. It's something that's shared by all of us as citizens. We have certain rights that will often assert themselves for us, so to speak. Some rights that are sufficiently widely recognized that we can trust most of the time that they're not going to be violated. There are some that are extreme examples that we can think of right off the bat. Chances are pretty good that if we're driving away today, you get pulled over by the Virginia Highway Patrol, they're probably not going to ask for proof of church attendance last Sunday. If they do, call me. I will help you. That right, the right to be free from that kind of intrusion into your religious life, is something that's sufficiently widely recognized that society is probably not going to bother you about it. The government certainly shouldn't bother you about it. But there are a lot of other rights that are a lot more subtle. A lot of other rights that, whether subtle or not, are widely disregarded by our government and that we need to assert. We need to assert much more aggressively than we have asserted them in recent decades. Among those, we could find the right to live in a nation in which the powers of our national government are, as James Madison described them, few and defined, while those reserved to the states are numerous and indefinite. That's a right. It's a right that is as clear from our 226-year-old founding document as any other. It's a right that was probably more important to the founding generation than any other that I can think of in the Constitution. And yet, it is a right that has been taken away from us, albeit by degrees, steadily over the last 75 years. That's a right that we must begin to assert. We must assert it every day. We must assert it until it is fully restored to us. One of the first places we begin in asserting this right is by preventing further expansion of government, by making sure that when Washington expands, people understand that it does so at the expense of this right, that it does so at the expense of our individual liberty. It does so at the expense of our right to be governed, first and foremost, by those closest to us. And that means that when we create a massive new bureaucracy, a massive new entitlement program, a massive new intrusion into the most personal aspects of your life, we do everything we can to stop it. It seems to me that if ever there were a threat to these kinds of rights, Obamacare is that threat. If ever there were a cause worth our resisting, Obamacare is that thing, and we've got to do everything we can to stop it. Now, there are those who will look at this and say, well, look, it's not really your problem. Obamacare was elected before you got to Washington. It is, in fact, the law of the land. This is something that's sort of water under the bridge. Get over it. Well, I'm not ready to get over it. There are certain things that we can't just look the other way on, and I've got a few responses to those who tell me that I've got to get over it. I want to tell you a story about my two sons. I've got twin boys who are 18 years old. They're good boys. They recently graduated from high school, both 4.0 students, and good kids. But I was driving down the road with them in our small town of Alpine, Utah, not too long ago. We were listening to the radio. There was a popular song on the radio, a song that we had heard many times before, but all of a sudden on this particular occasion, I noticed the words to that song, and all of a sudden I realized the words to that song were not exactly wholesome. In fact, they were not the kinds of words that any God-fearing father of teenage boys would want his kids listening to. And all of a sudden, I just took the opportunity to say, guys, have you ever really listened to the words of this? This is terrible. My son, John, without batting an eye, immediately said back to me, Dad, it's not bad if you don't think about it. And my first thought was, well, the point's irrefutable as far as it goes. My second thought was, my goodness, my son John has been advising the President of the United States. You see, there are quite a few things that are not bad, but only if you don't think about them. $17 trillion debt, not bad if you don't think about it. $1 trillion annual deficit, not bad if you don't think about it. Regulatory compliance costs associated with what comes out of Washington, $2 trillion a year, not bad, but only if you don't think about it. A massive government-orchestrated, Washington-managed takeover of 1/6 of our nation's economy, of our healthcare system. Not bad, but only if you don't think about it. You see, these things that we face today are things that we have to think about, things that we have no choice but to think about. Because if we don't think about them today, we'll have no opportunity to do anything about them tomorrow. As far as Obamacare being the law of the land, and therefore something we're somehow compelled to fund, I respectfully but forcefully disagree. In fact, for several reasons, I can think of few things with which I disagree more. In the first place, this law, Obamacare, well, sure, it is the law of the land. Let's consider a few things about how it came into existence. It was 2,700 pages of law that have subsequently morphed into 20,000 pages of regulations, and still growing significantly, by the way. Enacted into law by a Congress that had not read it, by a Congress that was told by the then Speaker of the House of Representatives, you have to pass this law to find out what's in it. It was a law that was subsequently challenged in the Supreme Court and, by the way, found to be constitutionally defective, unconstitutional, in two different respects as enacted by Congress. So the Supreme Court of the United States found that although it was enacted as a penalty, meaning the provision meant to enforce the individual mandate, was deliberately written as a penalty and not as a tax. Why? Well, because they tried to do it as a tax, and not surprisingly, they couldn't get the votes to do it. This would violate all kinds of things, even for liberal Democrats, many of them, who don't like to raise taxes on the middle class. And so they couldn't get the votes to enact this law if it contained such a tax. So they wrote it deliberately as a penalty, using language that under a century's worth of jurisprudence made clear that it was a penalty and not a tax. The Supreme Court conveniently found, well, this is a penalty and not a tax for purposes of the Anti-Injunction Act. Had they not found that, then they would not have had jurisdiction to reach the merits of the case. They couldn't have reviewed the case until at the earliest, 2014, when they started to enforce the so-called tax. So the court said it is a penalty, not a tax. In the very next breath, they said Congress has no authority under the Commerce Clause to enact this as a penalty, to penalize people for not buying health insurance. They lack the authority under the Commerce Clause, even as broadly as they have distorted and stretched the Commerce Clause authority. They said even this is even too far under that standard. And so the court essentially rewrote that provision as a tax, even though they had just concluded that it's not a tax, so that they could review it. Second, the court, by a 7-2 margin, found that it was unconstitutional with respect to the Medicaid expansion provisions, because this amounted to Congress dictating to the states, you must do X, and giving them no option, no opt-out, no choice. Well, as it was written, 7 justices concluded that that was unconstitutional. Ordinarily, what the court would be expected to do in that circumstance would be to move on and to decide whether or not that provision was severable from the others. That is, whether or not it was the heart of the statute or just sort of a wart, something that could be burned off and then ignored. I am absolutely certain that had they gone on to perform the severability analysis, they would have concluded that it was not severable. They would be taking out the heart of the legislation in question. It therefore would have sunk the entire ship of Obamacare. And for that very reason, 5 justices, led by the Chief Justice of the United States, John Roberts, rewrote that provision. And doing so was unconstitutional, and it was a betrayal of their judicial oaths. I felt so strongly about this ruling afterwards, I ended up writing a short book about it. It's called Why John Roberts Was Wrong About Health Care. It's available in ebook soon and paper book. You can buy it on Amazon for less than $4. The point of that book is Chief Justice John Roberts acted as a legislator that day. So Congress passed it without reading it. The Supreme Court had to rewrite it not just once, but twice, because they found it was unconstitutional. In 2 different respects as written. The president, since then, has rewritten the law 3 or 4, maybe more times, depending on which counting mechanism you use. He's rewritten it without any statutory or constitutional authority to do so. He has rewritten that law. You cannot read that law to allow him the authority to say, well, I'm just not going to enforce the employer mandate, or I'm not going to enforce the income verification provisions for purposes of determining eligibility for participation in the exchange subsidy program. He doesn't have that authority. So if the president's not going to follow the law, if the president insists, as he does, that the law is not ready to implement, Congress should not fund it, and they will not get my vote in any spending bill that includes Obamacare funding. I want to open up the floor to questions in just a moment, but before I do so, let me just close by talking to you a little bit about the events of the last couple of weeks and the condition in which we find ourselves right now. This has been a difficult time. I can't recall a time over the last 2.5 years in which I've experienced so much pain, so much fatigue, so much, well, tiredness, especially last week. You know, as Senator Cruz and I were standing on the floor of the Senate at 6 or 7 a.m. Wednesday morning, having spent the entire night standing on the Senate floor, speaking, keeping ourselves awake only by delivering lengthy discourses on one of our favorite topics, the Commerce Clause. You know, it's amazing that anyone would be paying attention at that hour, and yet I kept getting tweets from people saying, thanks for talking to us about Wickard v. Filburn. I don't think those words have ever been uttered before in the English language. As we both stood there with bloodshot eyes, with sore feet, with hoarse voices, the thought occurred to me. This is what winning feels like. Winning a fight against the Washington, D.C. establishment feels like this. It feels like being tired. It feels like being fatigued. This is what it's like to fight against an entrenched establishment, we're waging a battle that's not necessarily about Democrats versus Republicans. In some days, we long for the days when it was that simple. This time around, this is the American people fighting back against the Washington, D.C. political establishment, against people of both parties, and it is not easy. The fact that it's not easy does not make it not worth it. Quite to the contrary, the fact that it's not easy makes it an absolute moral imperative. And so I'd like to invite all within the sound of my voice to join me in this noble cause, to join me in the cause of restoring and protecting constitutionally limited government, which is our birthright, a birthright established 226 years ago by a group of brave Americans who met under harsh conditions in that hot, sweltering, humid summer of 1787 in Philadelphia. That was a moment that established the indisputable fact that the sons and daughters of America were meant to live free. This land is different than other lands. This land is exceptional. This land, I believe, is ordained by Almighty God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the same God who was later born to mortal parents in Bethlehem. That God wants us to live free. May we stand with him. May we stand together. May we stand with the American people in restoring and protecting those rights. Thank you very much.